Well, good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to be here with you today. I would like to express for everyone a very warm welcome to today's event called The Transformation Agenda, Cutting Through the Hype and the Future of Technology. This is a series of events that is sponsored by the Bahrain Economic Development Board, and I'm really happy to be here to continue our afternoon session. My name is Walter Pasquarelli. I lead our AI programs here at Economist Impact. Now, I will never forget, about a decade ago when I started out working in the field of AI strategy and governance, London was already back then a city that was considered almost like one of the big global capitals in terms of AI development. But if back then we might have looked at the labor market and the industry in the field of AI strategy and governance, the truth is that things were pretty much in their infancy. Institutes dealing with the questions brought out by AI were just very few. Businesses, whilst they were already possibly the most active actors investing in the technology, hadn't adapted as much in business lingo. And governments had just started to recognize the potential of the technology. I remember the majority of people who were trying to get into the field really had to look particularly hard to really find something that would be quite suitable. And even once we started working on some real projects that sought to develop the technologies, deploy them into industries, it felt that a lot of the questions that we were asking ourselves were pretty hypothetical. Some of the questions included, for example, what if we could develop tools that could write, compose music, or interact with us seamlessly? What if we could generate images and videos that blur the boundaries between what's real and what's not? And what if we were able to create AI assistants at our service, following orders and make our lives more productive? Now, the year's now 2023, and the questions that have been asked a decade ago, which we were expected perhaps to be answered 20 years from now, have actually been already answered to some extent. So the question is not anymore, what if, but what now? And that's really the context that sets today's conversation, which I'm really excited to be discussing with all of you. To be answering these questions, we have prepared two panel discussions, each addressing a critical element for today's event. We have, first of all, a panel that will be looking at sort of the technology beyond today. What technologies do we have reason to be excited about? What is hype? What is sort of a real opportunity? And how do we build these capabilities? We then have a fireside chat where we will be talking about a crucial issue within AI development, which is AI risk and how we mitigate that. And together, these sessions will form really sort of a piece of the puzzle in being able to answer some of the questions that our members of the audience you have. I should say, at The Economist, we do recognize and acknowledge that there is a lack of gender diversity among our speaker lineup for today, but I just wanted to assure you that our events team has made sure and tried to reach out as much as possible to different kinds of speakers to ensure that we have sufficient diversity here, but due to a lack of availability and the timeline, we were not able to secure a more diverse lineup of speakers. Right, we do have some microphones going around, so we have sufficient time for everyone to be asking some questions. I will open up the floor to the audience to ask them, and then anyone who has a question can just raise their hands and ask what is on their mind. Now, before we get started, I would like to thank again our sponsor, which is the Bahrain Economic Development Board. But without further ado, let's get started on our first panel. For this first panel on the topic of technological innovation, I'm really pleased to be welcoming on stage Musab Abdulla, who is the Executive Director of Business Development and ICT of the Bahrain Economic Development Board. We have Stephen Minton, who is the Vice President at the IDC, Jean de Fouggerolles, who is Managing Partner at Ascension, and Izak Oosthuizen, who is Founder and Managing Director at Zhero. Thank you very much for joining me. All right, let's start first of all with setting the foundations about what it is that we're talking about today, and that's the question of like the technologies that are sort of emerging, the hype behind it, and sort of the ones that we think have sort of most meat to the bone, as they say here. There's been a lot of terms like the AI race, the fourth industrial revolution. Someone even, I read a paper what's called the fifth industrial revolution and whatnot. On a scale from 1 to 10, to what extent would you say are we looking at something that is hype would be like one, or like something that has real substance and real transformative potential. Now, I would like to get started with Musab.
So, thank you, Walter. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. 1 to 10. You ask an open-ended question again and again, open-ended answer. So let me try and drill this down a little bit. Let's start with the concept of hype. So which technologies are hyped? All of them, until they're not. Okay, so all the technologies start with hype and excitement and potential about what might be, and then some of them fizzle out, and then some of them actually move on to deliver on that potential. And we've seen it everywhere from large-scale computing components to consumer electronics. Obviously, the one that's on everyone's mind is artificial intelligence. Okay, now there, artificial intelligence is a curious case because it is both overhyped, and yet at the same time, people don't fully acknowledge its potential. So it's kind of like saying, I can use a fire hose to fill up a water balloon. Well, sure, but it can do so much more than that. To give you an example of that, or sorry, before I give you an example of that, and I think it really comes down to the term artificial intelligence. So when artificial intelligence was first coined in, I believe, 1956, its original intention was to talk about computer applications that could do things faster than humans. But over time, partly through popular media, partly through how it's been used, it's come to encompass so much more than that. And now, really, the limits are imagination. So the problem with artificial intelligence is that we're focused on the word intelligence, not enough on the word artificial. Okay, there's certain assumptions that come with that. So for example, according to one artificial intelligence, rulers, the measuring instrument, cause malignant melanomas. Rulers cause tumors. Why? Because the data set that was fed to it, whenever it was benign, there was no ruler in the picture. But when it was malignant, they had a ruler next to it to measure the size of the melanoma. And the AI thought that, well, that's causing it. Okay? So there's a lot of hype, but we need to really just drill down to understand it. But to the second part of your question, what do I think is on the horizon? What are some of the more sort of interesting things? Actually, I think in the near to medium term, there's 3 particular technologies, the intersection of which is going to become very, very interesting. The first is artificial intelligence, because it's going to have the analysis protocols. It's going to be able to come up with an outcome. There's quantum computing, because that's what's going to give it the speed to analyze all potential outcomes. And reportedly, some of the early models, for example, that Google's come up with, quantum computing will be 100 to 150 million times faster than current technology. And then finally, AR and VR, augmented reality and virtual reality, because if you've got all that data and you've processed it, now you can visualize it. And I think that particular intersection is going to be a game changer, if you will.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Izak, I wanted to ask you a similar question. Any further thoughts on that? Sort of, what are sort of some areas that you think we have reason to be excited about?
I think it's very exciting, and there's a lot of productivity is obviously increasing, and there's your life becomes easier. But the core of all of this is the security and data protection that is lacking. And I'm just going to circle back to, we focus basically on small, medium enterprise companies and micro businesses and helping them securing their networks. And we cherry pick what is out there in the world, and we really have a difficult task with over 80% of the companies in the UK facing a cybersecurity incident. And I think it's basic problems, but I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, and I can share some of these challenges with you. It's basics, like people don't use passwords properly, or they store or they share passwords on post-it notes. They actually don't have proper backups, or the backups are not implemented correctly, or the selection of the data is not correct. So there are a lot of these very basic challenges. You don't need a large budget, but the more we are digitalizing, the more we're exposing ourselves. So that's
very interesting. And Stephen, I would like to ask you a question. Now, we've talked a lot about sort of these areas that are exciting, and I think Musab has provided us with a very interesting overview, and starting with, there's AI, and related to that, there's quantum computing, and there's the issue of cybersecurity as sort of an area that forms perhaps the backbone of being able to adopt these because they have to be secure. But do you feel there are some areas that are just really overhyped?
Well, I mean, the IT industry is more guilty of overhype than almost any other sector of the economy. We don't have to go back too far for a really good example of that. It was only 2 or 3 years ago that a well-known global consulting firm was predicting a $17 or $20 trillion industry around something called the metaverse, which got everybody excited. Got one company in particular so excited they changed their whole name to Meta. And that hype cycle has kind of died away, and that leaves this lingering impression amongst a lot of business users and technology users that there is a hype risk attached to every new thing which comes along. And so AI has that risk attached to it, and there is some skepticism around how long this generative AI hype cycle will last. There are a lot of big numbers. You know, IDC, we forecast that about 75 or 80% of the of GPU investment in the next 5 years will be driven by generative AI growth. But these are all forecasts. These are all based on the assumption that these technologies will gain the foothold that we expect them to. What's different, though, I think, is that we have been through a real transformation in the last 4 years, beginning with COVID and then the period immediately after COVID, where you might not have noticed, but there has been a pretty major change, a shift in the way that IT spending relates to the rest of the economy. So I'm old enough to have been an analyst through a few previous recessions, back to the dot-com bust, 2000, the financial crisis. And in all previous economic recessions, businesses cut back on their IT spending really quickly because they saw IT as an area to save money, to put things on hold. It was their response to any downturn or volatility in the economy was to pull back on some of these things which maybe had future promises of benefits which could have some type attached to them. These were the easy decisions to make to save money. That didn't happen during the COVID pandemic. IT spending actually grew more quickly during 2020 than it had during some of the previous 10 years. We had a massive explosion of growth in some areas, such as the shift to cloud and collaborative application security. So another little bump in growth during that period as well. And that plays into the fact that just IT has become so much more critical and central to business strategy and operations than it was even 5 years ago. And so, although it's true that there is probably some level of hype attached to some of these emerging technologies, just as there was with the metaverse, there's also a little bit more buy-in at the high level of business leadership.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I just remember. I think Stability AI. I think they raised in their seed phase $101 million. Mistral as well was over hundreds. I think it was 100, and I don't remember the exact number. For comparison, the majority of startups raised between 3 and 5, maybe 10 million at that stage. So that shows that there is that hype and sort of that really investment at the highest level of leadership. But the reason for that is because it's sort of there is an expected transformation that these technologies would have. And John, I'm interested to hear from you. If you think about these technologies and we look at perhaps one particular industry or different kinds of industry, what do you think is that the sort of the big transformation, the big promise that we're trying to achieve there?
Yes, so I look at it very much from business models. So we invest in early stage technology businesses, and obviously AI has been around for decades. It's machine learning, and our businesses that we back are using machine learning to kind of become more productive or work. But our focus is really on impact, like climate and social inequality. So we think technology is going to be the key driver and is a highly scalable, I guess, way of working to solve some of these problems. So that's the key kind of growth areas that I see is how can we solve this climate crisis? And there are technologies out there that if you break down every element of climate problems, whether that's overfishing and needing to feed fish farms, there are solutions out there, and technology can scale that quickly. Without that, I think we're going to be have a big problem for humanity, and that's where the focus should be, and that's where the growth should come from.
Interesting. And I would like to take one point that I think you just mentioned, which is the topic of technology as sort of an enabler of scale, essentially.
Yes.
Would you say that's the main?
Yes. So we started doing impact 8 years ago, and before we looked at all sorts of models, but we saw that technology was the best way to kind of grow commercially quickly, but also reach the most people. So one of our businesses uses AI called Food Steps, and it's basically mapping out the whole food supply chain so everybody can understand what that carbon footprint of what you're getting on your plate is. And so it's a business model, it's a SaaS business selling to all sorts of food suppliers, but it's using AI and machine learning to map out the world's basically supply chains. And unless we start to understand that and take that seriously, we're just not going to progress.
Interesting. I want to talk a little bit more about the challenges in sort of deploying these kinds of systems. We can all talk about the opportunities, and I think that's great, but when it comes to working with them, I think that things get a little trickier, let's say. And Musab, I'd like to know from you, based on your experience and what you're observing, what are the challenges that you're seeing right now for deploying these kinds of technologies, be it either generative AI or IoT or any of the sort of more promising ones?
I think I can sum up the answer to that in one word: people. The challenge is people. Whenever you look at any, so to Izak's point earlier about cybersecurity, when you look at cybersecurity, the weakest link is always people. And I think as engineers, as technologists, we work with systems that are by and large very predictable. People are not. There's so much more to them that's going on. So how does that play out in practice? Well, broadly speaking, to get something like this done, to institute a cultural shift, a technological shift, you need 3 levels of people. You need the visionaries that have the objective, that have the way forward, they have the end in sight. You've got the people that are actually doing it in some shape or form, whether they're developing it or rolling it out. And you've got the people that are using it. And so what we've done, if you allow me to provide a couple of illustrations on how we've done it, we in Bahrain, what we've done is we've invested a lot of our vision, our time, our effort, our resources into talent, into people. And this is from the very top. So we have been blessed with clear vision from leadership to digitize, to educate. And this has been going on for the last several decades. From the middle layer, there's been an engagement between government and private sector. In the panel earlier today, my colleague was talking about an engagement we have with Citibank, where we've set up a coding hub in Bahrain for 1,000 coders. But we also have an engagement with AWS, where we have cloud innovation centers with universities. And Bahrain is unique in that outside of the US, we're the only country in the world to have 2. Other countries only have 1, if any. And at the people level, we do a lot to educate and raise awareness. There are efforts such as cyber safety that is done by our telecom regulator. There's outreach from our startup community and so on. And what that's resulted in is a society that's very technologically savvy, very tech literate, and as such, it makes it a lot easier for us to deploy new technologies and gauge the uptake, because at the end of the day, you might have purpose A in mind for it. What they do with it could be very different. So that's been an interesting journey that we've had.
That's fascinating. And Izak, you touched on the topic of personal data protection and privacy. I remember just from 5 years ago, I was at a conference where someone made the very bold claim saying, we live in a post-privacy world. Mm-hmm. And everyone was like, no, like, and the screams were wasn't that bad, but it was pretty intense, the reaction that ensued. Are we in denial about being able to control the data about us? Or is there an actual sort of possibility still in a world that is so fundamentally interconnected?
Well, just circling back to what we see in businesses again is that the basics are not followed, and we'll see environments where contractors or freelancers are logging onto your corporate environment. You have no idea what's actually installed or what is. So your staging platform, the device that you actually use to access your data. And that's where the compliance starts. And that's normally where the compromise is happening also. And the people, as long as the people are breaking these rules, and insurance companies almost enabling their behavior because they're providing insurance on probability, and they don't really have true visibility on what is happening inside a small, just a focus on businesses. And what we see in businesses is if you don't have control of how a company is behaving, and you have your business owners and your office managers and your IT suppliers sometimes allowing and enabling this bad behavior and not setting it up to a certain standard. So as long as if there's no standard, if there's no MOT for business how to set up their IT, things will not change.
Interesting. So as soon as we have the standard, then we can say we think
There needs to be a standard, and until there's no standard, there are just too many variables. What is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity is a list of components that needs to be in harmony. And if you take it's like a wall you build up, and if you take any of those components out of the wall, you're at risk. Data is at risk, compliance, etc. So that's the key. And I think what I also see often is there's this trend where there's overemphasis or this excitement about dark web scanning or biometrics or passwords. But those are just small components making up the security or helping you with data protection. And just a final point, just circling back to what you mentioned about you have these 3 layers and you have the users. And I think what I see often is that we are saying 43%, or the statistics are showing that 43% of all incidents are human error. Now, I have a different view on that. We need to build systems that safeguard the humans. Even though we can train, and I can click on something, I've got 25 years in IT, but I can click on something, but if the systems are set up correctly with proper ransomware protection, sorry, this is a bit technical, but antivirus and the right systems in place, I'm protected. So I think it's almost an unfair statement to make, to say it's human error. We need to build the systems and set it up correctly.
Interesting. And I think that's quite an interesting point. Building on Musab's point, that sort of like technological systems can be perhaps a little bit more predictable. There is a bit of, and that's something we're going to discuss in the next session actually about AI risk, that sort of there is a general bit of a distrust sometimes out of default almost towards tech systems. But then the question is, to what extent do you trust other humans? And then it's like, I don't know. And so I'll be really curious to understand better later on, like the different components that constitute trust for us as we scale these systems. But I would like to bring the conversation a bit more to Jean now, who I think you've been mentioning this idea of sort of like being climate neutral and social inclusion, and especially when it comes to tech adoption. And what strategies do you see working out well when it comes to technological innovation that are inclusive and that benefit, or at least do not disadvantage any segments of society?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, let's say 30% of the population have a thin credit file or no credit file. I'm talking about the UK now. So if they want to access credit like anybody else who's got a credit file, they can't really access credit, so they go to payday lenders and they get into a debt spiral, and that's like impacting a huge part of our population. So we backed a business called Credit Kudos, which was using open banking and machine learning to try and create a more granular view of each individual. So even if you have a thin credit file, they could actually start creating a credit file and allow you to access credit more fairly. So solutions like that. On the circular economy, I think the problem is the cost of moving from our current way that we operate, which is not circular, to circular, is going to cost a lot of money. So we have another investment that's basically totally circular. It cleanses all the water. So 30% of ocean plastics come from people doing their laundry across the world. Does anybody care? Don't know. What's the impact on fish and us? We don't know yet, but we can probably imagine it's going to be quite bad. Are there solutions out there that can stop that? Yes. But the cost of telling somebody who's barely able to like feed their kids that they're going to have to swap their washing machine in their house for a more expensive solution in this cost of living crisis. So I think those are the big questions that if we don't resolve them in the next 10 years, it's going to be, like COVID, but worse.
Interesting. I would like to bring the conversation now a little bit more to sort of perhaps a bit more the security requirements that we're seeing out there as sort of these technologies develop. And Izak, I just wanted to just briefly, so that you can lay out for us sort of the main components when we talk about the security. How is sort of the threat landscape changing at the moment in terms of cybersecurity? What do you think are sort of some of the areas that are critical investment areas for?
I think one of the key changes that we see, obviously pre-COVID, after COVID, but the there used to be a strong emphasis on security in the office and where your server environment is, and obviously a lot of people are moving into the hybrid cloud environments, and they are moving into cloud, and there's this assumption problem that as soon as we move to the cloud, you are safe, and that is a wrong assumption, and that we can break some of the rules. So there's some critical services for micro businesses, small, medium enterprise companies that a server used to contain that needs to be replicated when you move into the cloud. Now, in a more technical term, this is called Active Directory. This is connecting all the systems together, and that's implementing password protection, password policies, multi-factor authentication, and people are compromising on that. Moving to the cloud is an assumption of it's secure, it's updated. These are normally skipped, or there are no backups, or they assume there is a backup. So these are problems that a lot of small, medium enterprise companies are facing, where there's this assumptions of moving to the cloud, and now that we can access the cloud, we are using any device to access it. And this is so even with open banking, if the staging platform is not secure and it's not compliant, there can be a compromise. And one of the other problems we also see is as the security moves from the office and strong firewall is actually useless because we have people working from absolutely everywhere. So the security is moving to the actual endpoints. And what we also see over the years is, especially with ransomware, 73% of the attacks are ransomware, and that antivirus is no longer good enough. So it's coming back to a combination of things that you have to have in place, and you have to have dedicated ransomware protection.
Interesting.
It's an absolute must.
Stephen, do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cloud is of course a transformational hype cycle which has been successful in the last 10 years, and it has created all of these new security implications and issues for organizations to deal with. But it's also a good example of kind of the counter argument to the whole metaverse hype cycle. The cloud did pan out in the way that technologists predicted. It did provide the productivity and the return on investment that we were predicting a decade ago, and now pretty much everything runs in the cloud. You know, most of pretty much 100% of IT spending growth is cloud related in the last couple of years. So the cloud is a successful hype cycle. It creates security implications. It also creates general complexity implications. And that's one thing I guess I would just add that we need to be careful about when we think about all of these emerging technologies, AI, cloud, everything else, is that when we go too quickly, we often end up with a complexity crisis. We did this in the early 2000s. We did it to some extent after the financial crisis. So we need to be careful about that because for example, the average organization now is running about 750 different SaaS applications from different vendors across their organization. And that's just one statistic which gives you an idea of the amount of complexity which now exists in terms of making sure that all that stays glued together from a security perspective, as well as from a productivity and an efficiency perspective as well.
Interesting. So now we've talked a bit about sort of the different kinds of technologies that are interesting, the hype versus reality, some of the challenges that we find, but perhaps in every panel and every discussion and every report that I've read, one of the issues that comes out most is the topic of talent. And I was just like, in preparation for this panel discussion, I was doing my research and I found an article from The Economist that said something like, businesses are struggling to find the right kinds of tech talent. And I was like, perfect, this is exactly what I was looking for. And then I found the date of publication, 1997. And I looked up, and literally every year we've been publishing a new piece that talked about exactly this issue. So this issue keeps being important. It probably will remain important, but I'll be particularly curious to hear. Now, I'd like to start with you, Musab. So what do you think are some of the skills or perhaps the mindset that we need to have as leaders when talking about sort of the future of work and the skills that are required in the digital era?
This is a question that keeps changing, the answer to which keeps changing as technology evolves. But it starts, I think to answer that question, you first need to understand that technology is progressing, developing, and growing at a pace that's outstripping the human capability to individually to keep up. Okay, to varying levels of that. So if I was to begin an academic program and start teaching a youngster a programming language, a language model for AI, whatever, chances are by the time they've graduated, it's out of date. Okay, so we can't follow the model of give them information and deploy that information. Instead, it really should be about give them tools, understand the limitations of those tools, because if all you are equipped with are hammers, every problem starts to look like a nail, and then teach them how to critically think and go out. Which is why I think we're seeing a lot more of a shift towards hands-on training. We're seeing a lot more of a shift of being able to be more adaptable. And the fact of the matter is, you can't do it in isolation. A lot of the time, academia will come up with programs that they think are fit for purpose. And when the person graduates, they go to a company or a government body to be hired, and they're like, oh no, we don't need that. In fact, we haven't needed that for the last 10 years. So there has to be a collaboration between the private sector, the academic sector, the public sector, to understand not necessarily what knowledge, the knowledge is important, but what tools, and equip them with the discipline and the ability to continuously update that information as we go. If we don't do that, I'm not sure how they're going to keep up, especially once we start putting something like AI into the field. It's going to progress at an exponential rate.
Fascinating. So that basically, it means we need to break down the silos between, on the one hand, the academic institute, or like educational institutions, governments, and businesses, to ensure that there is interaction to understand what is actually needed in the market right now.
Oh, absolutely. And to touch on something earlier about which was in a cybersecurity context, but it applies here as well, it's all about trust. I mean, so for example, one thing that we've done is I made reference to a large software development hub. Citibank, in part of doing that, has engaged with universities, and now we're seeing a gradual development of the academic program, so that as students come out, they're much more well-equipped for the workforce. We're seeing a number of different short, intensive training, that vocational training that allows them to be trained much more easily. So yes, we do need to break down the silos. It requires trust between the different actors that are going there, and there has to be that flexibility and dynamism to be able to course correct. Because maybe today I make a decision, and in as little as 6 months it's out of date. Maybe it's not for 5 years, but there needs to be that trust and that flexibility and that communication.
Interesting. Stephen, similar question to you, but perhaps a little bit more from a different angle. How do you feel our emerging technologies are reshaping some job roles overall? Is there some interesting data points that you think are worth mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, we've already starting to see the emergence of trends such as financial institutions hiring more technology-skilled individuals in the last few years who are focused on developing AI solutions and digital transformation solutions in general. So that movement of the IT expertise into other areas of the business is really important. We've kind of moved away from that IT department centralized model that we had 20 years ago, where a company would just hire a tech department and they would be responsible for running the infrastructure and the applications. Now it's integrated right into every business unit, and so those business units are hiring people with those technological skills, but also who can understand the business alongside that. So that's changing the way that companies are hiring. That's becoming a more necessary skill set for other types of jobs across different industries, and of course that needs to continue because the lack of skills is a bottleneck. I mean, you already mentioned it. It is a huge bottleneck, especially in certain regions of the world, which will make it difficult to derive the benefits of AI in the next 10 years. Is the lack of skilled individuals to implement this stuff.
Interesting. To follow up, one question I've heard a few people asking already: prompt engineering. Is that sort of? I think I heard someone laughing actually. Prompt engineering. What's the deal with that? Is that? Do you feel there is a real sort of like future for that, or is it sort of like?
Is that again? Prompt engineering.
Prompt engineering. It's people that basically, for the audience, perhaps interesting. It's people that are basically interact with Gen AI tools, like the guys that are paid to give ChatGPT the instructions on what it should say. And I don't know, it's been going around on LinkedIn and Twitter, these like huge. All right, I'll go to the next question. But
I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
So one of my best friends runs a consultancy firm, and she was doing a big piece of work for a big cosmetic company. And the cosmetic company, when they gave her the brief, they said, this is what ChatGPT gave us. So like, this is your starting point for like the deck and the kind of critical thinking we want from you. So my friend was quite kind of disturbed by this, because obviously, if you want to charge somebody a high margin consultancy business and your client gives you like basically what's 90% good before you even started, it's quite difficult to mark it up. So obviously could have a big impact on those types of businesses and many more.
Yeah. And sorry, I'd like to just comment on that. I think prompt engineering as a concept is one of those hypes. Okay, because what is prompt engineering? It's the ability to communicate. And in fact, in some shape or form, we've been doing that ever since search engines became commonplace. Because how do you generate a search result if you don't know how to provide the right search terms and the right prompt? And knowing that this one word could be interpreted in 3 different ways, and you're leaving it up to the engine to figure out. So I think it's a hype term. It's one of those things that's come with the AI. Is it needed? Yes, but communication is always needed, and clarity of communication is always needed.
I think that's a very nice way of sort of like taking that discussion and putting it to rest. It's an ability to communicate, whether it's with humans or with machines. It will matter always in some way. All right, so we have about 12 more minutes. I have plenty of questions, but I would give everyone would like to give everyone the opportunity to ask some questions to our panelists. We have some microphones going around. Who would like to go first? Yes, you, sir. Please make sure to introduce yourself with your name and ideally the organization you work for.
Can I just talk?
We have a microphone coming for you. Just there we go. Yeah.
Hi, very interesting discussion. My name is Manohar Ganshani, and I specialize and practice cybersecurity, and I come from a global company called LTI Mindtree. My question to you is, Izak, you very well mentioned and touched upon the fundamental basics of the cybersecurity. The companies who fail, who do not follow the fundamentals, they do fail. And there's another dimension to it, which is I see is companies who do not follow the risk-based approach, they do fail. What's your take on that?
The risk-based approach. So are you more referring to doing penetration testing, so a more reactive? Okay, so from my point of view, is that what you mean?
Companies generally, I would say they ought to know what is their risk and where is this risk. That's a fundamental thing. And Musab actually touched upon one topic is about trust. In context of security, establishing the trust is by way of actually starting with zero trust, and that's the starting point.
I think there are a lot of components that obviously need to be in place, but working on the risk, a risk assessment based on what components? I mean, we're talking about all the components you can use in the cloud. Is there anything specifically you're referring to, or?
I'm not specific. I'm referring to any specific thing. I'm just saying that companies do need to realize that they have to take a risk-based approach.
Yes.
To cover all the aspects of different technology components.
Thank you. So we're in agreement. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, the gentleman in the back, and then you.
Tim Hubbard, King's College London, Genomics England, and Health Data Research UK. So the privacy question kind of got ducked. Health is obviously a big area of potential transformation, but the public is worried about privacy of their health data, possibly more than anything else. However, there are moves to secure that. The NHS is switching to secure data environments. Data's not being distributed. The recognition, you can't anonymize it properly with all the information on social media, so lock it behind closed doors, but allow companies, academics to work on it there. So do you think that's going to be enough, the people with the cybersecurity to protect? Do you think that that's going to be robust enough?
You can store the data in the deepest bunker in the world and the most secure, but again, where your problem comes in is if you have a contractor coming in and he wants to analyze the data, so your staging platform that's used to connect to the data is normally where the problem is. And this is where what I believe, what I see actually, is where they compromise most of the times. Like I've seen actually solar farms, so it's secure, everything is secure, and to connect to the solar farm and to analyze the data is secure, but the technician or the third-party company accessing the data, there was a compromise on the local staging platform. So the whole life cycle, it needs to be taken into account. And how do you access the data? If you access it on the tablet, is the tablet, we all refer to MDM, mobile device management, is it jailbroken? What else is installed on there? Is there spyware on there? This is normally how it happens. So you can, and this is circling back to this overemphasis on we are going to store the data on a certain location and it's so secure, but it's as secure as the weakest link in the equation.
I think if I could touch upon this. So the fundamental issue here is that limited information is also of limited use. Okay, in order to actually generate the benefits, you need to have a larger data set. But then when you have a larger data set, you have larger exposure, larger risks, and then all these privacy concerns come into place. And what we've seen over the years is essentially an all or nothing approach. Either all the data is accessible, or all the data is, as it's like said, in the deepest, darkest bunker. Now, there are some interesting approaches where instead of giving the data to the analyst asks a question, goes to the secure site and gets an answer. But if they get the question wrong, they'll get the wrong answer. But it is one of the more, I would say, promising ways to handle that data because the data itself never actually leaves. It's just a query with the response. So that I think is something that could be explored, especially for very sensitive areas such as healthcare.
And that is the approach being adopted.
Brilliant.
Great. The lady here in the front.
Hello, I'm Melissa Zanocco from the Infrastructure Client Group. For me, if this is about kind of the future, so the next step, I think it's really based on interoperability. So I think we're talking a lot about lots of separate things and the potential of lots of separate things. But I think I agree with you about that it's the world problems, that they're systemic, climate change, adaptation, mitigation, biodiversity loss, social equity. All these things are interconnected. And I think the solutions are going to come from when all these things can sort of talk to each other and they're interoperable. I just wondered what your views are, because that comes in, then the security comes into that, the people bit comes into that. It kind of follows on from what you just said about things like distributed architecture. Yep. Like we've been looking in the UK at having a national infrastructure management framework, information management framework. How do we get the interoperability? Do you agree we need it as well?
So, if I could jump in. There was a panel this morning on financial services and transformation of financial services, and the lady, Miss Angela, apologies I forgot her last name, she brought up a very interesting point that resonated strongly with me. It was, we need to sometimes build with the intention to decommission. Okay, so that transitional period is very, very important, and you hit the nail on the head about with all these legacy systems and legacy skills sometimes. A lot of it is, if I was to break it down to a few key components, first of all, strip away the hype. We need to understand what are we trying to achieve, what is the tool, what is the actual change. A lot of technological innovation is incremental. So sometimes the hype makes it seem like it's this big shift, when actually it's just we're changing the data set. But then the other thing is, if it is a complete fundamental shift, which is fairly rare, I would say, we need to plan it. And sometimes we need to add a third step in between to try and do that. So can it be done? I think absolutely yes, but it's so contextual. It's really about understanding the impact. Who are the negative actors there? Who are the positive actors there? And then taking it from there. And a lot of it's just understanding the fundamentals. Perhaps an oversimplified answer, but I think that's one approach.
We have a few more questions. First,
I just want to add, if I might just quickly add also, I think very key there is that what we see, I'll give a simplified version of it, is that we have access to all these cloud services and we have access to our laptop and we have access to the data. But when we switch off this user and this user is leaving the organization, these systems are not connected, and we sometimes forget to have let's take example accounting software Zhero. So if you could have a system that sort of, if you press disable here, it shuts down all the other systems also wherever you might have access to. So the key would be to have all the systems connected. So if you have a password policy here, changing the passwords every 7 days or whatever it might be, it applies to all the systems that you have access to. So that will be the key for open banking and all of those.
Brilliant. Yeah, we have the gentleman in the back here who is.
Sorry, there is a human behind the pillar there, Walter. I am.
No, I'm just seeing myself.
Thank you. No, it's fine. Thank you. Hello, panel. Aaron Woods. I'm the Group CIO at the Institution of Civil Engineers. My question's about generative AI. The technology is great, but it's utterly reliant on human content that's already been generated. We're starting to see a pushback in Hollywood with writers going on strike. Do you see a point coming where content is actually retracted from the availability for these AIs to get to it? Are we going to see a battle around ownership on that?
I think we might see a battle, but that battle will be lost by the content creators in the same way that it was lost when news creators tried to keep that content from search engines over the last 20 years. The economic benefits of leveraging that content will outweigh the protestations, I guess, of the creators in the long term. It would be my opinion.
I think the record labels and others like that are kind of petrified because you can feed all of Eminem's songs into ChatGPT and generative AI, and then they can start creating, Eminem songs for you that sound exactly like him. So that could be a good thing because Eminem could create loads of albums without doing any work, or and just put his name on top of it. It could be a bad thing because synthetic music will just like replace the human, and so I think the record labels are wondering what to do about all that.
Just a quick comment on that one. That question parallels a lot of the questions around privacy of data. So, how much, what of my data can you use? The thing is, my personal view on it is that the biggest source of personal data is the person. We put so much on social media, we put so much out there, and all these forms that we fill for companies and actors that we don't fully trust, that it's already out there. So, strictly speaking, in the battle between AI and the content owners, I'm not sure there's going to be an amicable resolution there. But maybe that's not where the fight should be. Maybe the fight should be who uses it, who buys it, who pays for it. Because if there's no buyer, if there's no demand, then there's no sale. So perhaps we're fighting the wrong argument.
And sorry, when YouTube launched, all the big content owners were suing YouTube, and then YouTube became so big, they all did commercial deals off the back of it. So you might see the same thing.
Yeah. I think you definitely struck a chord with your question. I recommend checking out the discussion between fair use principle and data licensing as well. So there's the two extremes of the debate that people have said. But anyway, we have time for one more question. I think the gentleman here in the front has been raising his hand. We have time outside for further discussion. To reach out, please. Yes.
Omar Suleiman from Wahid, the world's largest halal fintech. Question is more about coming back to investing, innovating, and inventing to shape the future. Now, technology, we can see, can either be a force for good, or it can just be used to deliver bad products that have bad outcomes quicker, faster, more efficiently, and cheaper. How do we ensure that technology is actually shaping the world that we live in a better way? How do we ensure that flow of capital is driven towards that, and there's true democratization of talent to be able to do that? Because when we look at technology companies, where they're based and the outcomes that have achieved by them, what's happening with the rest of the world, and how do we use technology properly to make positive impacts?
Well, invest in funds that are backing impact businesses at pre-seed, and then invest in funds that are backing impact businesses at late seed, Series A, Series B, Series C, and put capital into fund managers and businesses that are trying to make the world a better place, rather than a random software businesses that's trying to make you more productive.
Well, I think, sorry, apologies for taking the mic yet again. there's two ends to the argument. You can regulate, you can raise awareness. Okay. Now the problem with regulation is that you're assuming that the regulator is going to make the right choice, and the regulator usually, in most cases, is trying to create a level playing field, not favor necessarily one product over another or render judgment on it. So it's about awareness. I mean, if you look at, for example, healthy eating, a lot of people are doing it not necessarily because it's cheaper, but because it makes more sense. It aligns with their values, and that comes down to two points that we've made on this panel today repeatedly: trust and communication. And I think it's about engaging that, getting to the right wavelength, educating people, raising awareness about the positive and negative impact of their choices, and then taking it from there.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm afraid we're out of time. Please do reach out to our speakers, do reach out to anyone you're interested in continuing the conversation. That's really the purpose of these kinds of events. But in any case, ladies and gentlemen, please thank our speakers for their insights. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Keep in touch. Brilliant. So I think, as has become very clear from the discussion, is that the investment sets and the interest, for that matter, business, political, social interest that is going on in Gen AI tools is immense. I don't have any exact numbers right now, but I think one study produced by, I believe it was Goldman Sachs, said that generative AI could add something like 7% to the global economy by 2030. And the reaction to that study, I remember, were usually, oh, this is great, this is fantastic, such a big opportunity. But there was one big caveat that they added to that, and that is, that can only happen if we start investing in it right now. And the issue with that, as a number of civil society organizations started remarking, was that if we say we need to rush the development, we need to rush the investment in these technologies, that creates an issue of risk and safety. And that is what I would like to discuss with you, ladies and gentlemen, here in this fireside chat, for which I'm very pleased to have on board David Leslie, who is the Director of Ethics and Responsible Innovation Research at the Alan Turing Institute. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
So, I wanted to start with one question that I think, one topic that perhaps a lot of people have been seeing on their feeds, on their social media posts, on the newspaper outlets, and so on. With sort of the rise of AI and sort of advancements in technology and new kinds of breakthroughs that have been achieved, there have been also a number of letters signed. Open calls that passed for the development of AI, sort of some letters to policymakers that were provided by a number of actually very eminent scholars and business leaders and different kinds of people. What should we make of these?
Starting me off with the hot button issue. So yes, I think we do need to pay attention to the scaled risks that are involved with this kind of new generation of foundation models and generative AI. I would say, though, that just as we were talking about hype in the previous group, we need to be aware of the hype, because the hype around what's actually happening in the technology can take our eye off of some of the real immediate problems. So in a lot of these letters, these public statements, there's this kind of sense that we're facing this existential risk, right? That underlying this, there's a sense that it may well be that artificial general intelligence is going to take off, and we'll have a kind of, they call it an intelligence explosion, superintelligence. I caution against that type of speculation. We have to understand what these technologies are and what they're doing. These are this new generation of technology. These are very sophisticated pattern matchers. It may well have emergent qualities, so they may well be able to function in the world in ways that have been unanticipated by their creators. But it doesn't mean that these are so-called intelligent agents operating in the world. And we have to be very careful, because when we start to worry, right, that the robots are going to take over, then it takes our attention away from issues of data privacy, as we've been talking about, protection, issues that have to do with the cropping up of discrimination, other cybersecurity threats that come up. So I would say one of the important things that we need in society right now is we need to change this narrative. There are a lot of computer scientists who are helping themselves to this category of superintelligence, but in virtue of the science itself, that type of speculation doesn't line up with what's actually happening in the science.
Interesting. So you're saying, to sum it up, and I think that's actually you provide a very detailed answer here, which I think is great, to sort of this issue of the fear of existential risks and the intelligence explosion. Whilst there might be a theoretical possibility of something like this happening in the future, the real risks that we need to focus on are the ones that are happening today.
It's true, but I would say, we can make a distinction between the global catastrophic risks that are already in potential in the technology. So, for instance, we could have scaled bioterrorism. We could, just in virtue of bad actors misappropriating these technologies and creating antigens or bioweaponry. We are at a moment where we are facing large-scale risks, but we need to disentangle that kind of long-term view that the robots are. The AI is going to get away from us from really focusing on the salient problems.
Interesting. Let's narrow the conversation then down to sort of some of the immediate risks that we're facing nowadays, and to add sort of a further focusing it on generative AI in particular, so rather than the AI as a whole. We're looking at generative AI just to keep it nice and focused. Can you provide a sort of for individuals, perhaps on a societal basis, if we want, what do you think is sort of like the risks that we can map? Are there different categories that you can draw there to? Yeah.
Sure. When we think about this, I think it's helpful to sort of organize risks into risk to individual people, risks to sort of wider social structures of society, and risks to environment and biosphere. Those are three different levels of risk that we're experiencing. So, for instance, risks to individuals. Discussion about privacy has already happened in the room today, but I would point out, in furtherance of Tim's comment, that there's a problem here. We might say, you mentioned that there's this discussion of privacy is over, but there's a problem here. These large-scale models have basically scraped text corpora from all over the internet and beyond. And what that means is, when you've got such high-dimensional models and such scaled data sets, there's simply no way, technically speaking, to eliminate possibilities of data leakage, of other forms of privacy violation, which might happen downstream from the training of these systems. If you have adversarial contact with the systems, you can game the system. You can game the system and expose personal or sensitive information about people. So we do face this issue now, where the complexity of the systems have put them out of reach for the control, like the proper control of the system. So the data protection and privacy issue is a big one. There are other ones that actually have come up as we've been talking. One is this tendency for people to, in interacting with ChatGPT or another sort of text-generating system, to anthropomorphize the system, to read agency into the system. And this can be extremely difficult. It's an extremely difficult problem. In the 1970s, Joseph Weizenbaum, the computer scientist, wrote about the ELIZA effect, where Weizenbaum had created this very simple chatbot that was just running on a few rules. And what he noticed was that human interactors who were kind of interacting with the technology suddenly sort of superimposed on the technology personality, and they formed immediate emotional bonds with the chatbots. This was in the 1970s, right? Now fast forward now to the world of Pi and the world of ChatGPT. In this world, one can conceivably be in an environment where people form bonds with the technology in ways that subjects them to possible manipulation, right? So, think about all of the various attempts to, be fraudulent that might happen. Like you get you get phishing emails or whatnot. Now, think about how effective that world of fraud could be when people have a kind of personal bond to the chat GPT or whatever the chatbot is. And so we do live in this world where it's not only a sense of what we call on the theoretical side, we say this is de-agentification, because suddenly your dignity is being harmed because you're treating a technology as if it has agency. And so in this way, we do face this pretty big problem.
And David, I want to, you and I spend a lot of time in the field. I'm not sure how much, like, sort of, to help with the terminology.
Sure.
When you say, for example, these like foundation models,
Yes.
these are basically these giant models that have all the data from the web and sort of allow to make these decisions and outputs that feel almost a bit real.
Yeah.
When you say they've become so complex
Yes.
and so that it's difficult to understand where and what has gone wrong and how the data all works, you're referring to the black box, is that correct?
Right, so this actually, for a few years now, since we've had, the big ones are the artificial neural networks, right, which is, basically what's happening here. So it's been, a decade of talking about the algorithmic black box, which is where the systems, so these systems are basically mapping functions. They're mathematical functions. And in this room, when we think about problems and we think about moving around the world, we're thinking in terms of maybe a few variables at a time, right? We're connecting a few variables, not more than maybe 5 or 10 variables. A neural network, which is the basis of these technologies, is operating literally with billions of variables or parameters. And so when we would try to understand how the interconnections between all of those variables to produce a prediction is working, we can't do it because it's beyond our kind of human scale understanding or human scale semantics. So we do have, right, this black box problem. But I'll just also point out one thing about foundation models, just a basic kind of primer on foundation models, right? So these systems, now speaking specifically about large language models, are basically they're basically word embeddings so that you have a string of symbols that are parsed into chunks. And what the system is doing is if you sort of take that string and take it out of our language and just make it into binary, so it would be nonsense to us. Basically, the systems are just taking those chunks, connecting them with other chunks of information, and then picking up patterns or sequences in the underlying large data distribution. And so when that system works and is making predictions, all it's doing is it's picking up patterns and rendering prediction. There's no connection to the world. There's no connection to the ground truth. In this room, we have ground truth, right? You're sitting at a table, I'm talking to you, I've got a microphone in my ear, right? We have ground truth. These are the facts of our lived experience. That's not what's happening in a foundation model. The foundation model is simply making a prediction based upon connections between chunks of binary. That's all that's happening there. It's entirely interpreter dependent. It's entirely dependent.
So it's like, what's the most likely word that's going to come next in my sentence, effectively?
What's the probability that the next word will be the word that links most appropriately with the underlying data distribution?
Of course. So when we say, like, that we have this foundation models and it's so difficult to understand exactly what goes on, I think I saw a proposal from the European Commission, sort of some of their early ideas on managing generative AI tools and foundation models, and they said that the developers of these foundation models are responsible when things go wrong, instead of sort of when people that use them. So I developed that basically means that it's you're saying it's not possible, effectively. Is that correct, that these can be hold accountable when sort of for the models, if it's so difficult to understand what's going on?
Right. So that's a tricky way to flip
Maybe
it.
I'm stretching a bit.
No. It's a tricky way to flip it, but it's a good point. So there are different ways you can hold somebody accountable, right, for technology, and we know this from complex transportation systems and pharmaceuticals, for instance, where oftentimes we don't understand the underlying rationale of a system, right?
Yeah.
So with regard to foundation models, there are ways you can hold somebody accountable for the output. and the underlying logic of the output, right? This is where the black box is really an important issue, because it's the underlying rationale, right, of an output that becomes inaccessible when you've got an operating foundation model. But let me quickly just finish. So that's outcome. But we also have the processes of designing, developing, and deploying the system. And those processes are processes that are legitimately subject to governance constraints that can establish the responsibility of the innovation lifecycle. And so, where regulation has gone, especially when we get into sort of, black box type AI technology, is to focus on the assuring that the processes behind the design, development, and deployment have been undertaken with sufficient diligence and cutting across all of the significant or salient areas or pain points.
Interesting. Could you provide us with an example, sort of a real life example of how this could look like, just so
yeah, sure. I mean, this sounds like like governance. It sounds like an abstract concept.
I mean, I love it, but
right. Well, but just think about what are the qualities that you want to sort of ensure in the system, right? Well, here I'll give you a few. So, and these now become part of the governance story. We want to ensure the safety of the system. So we want to ensure that they're secure, reliable, robust. We want to ensure the fairness of the system. So we want to make sure that it's non-discriminatory, that it's been properly bias mitigated, that it has sufficient awareness of equality issues. You want to ensure that it's transparent in the sense that the processes of building it have been well documented and evidenced from end to end. We want to make sure that the data that's basically 80% of what's going on, that there's been proper data stewardship and responsible data management. So data quality, data integrity, data privacy and protection. All of those dimensions can be assured through diligent governance processes. Like, have you had sufficient bias mitigation practices? Have you done enough robustness testing? Have you hardened your model enough? Do you have a sufficiently performant model that's been differentially tested on different social or ethnic groups, right? All of those things are governance actions that can be taken before, ex ante, before the technology's out in the world. Interesting, that's fascinating.
I would like to offer people a quick opportunity to ask some questions. I have a long list of questions still that I have ready. Okay, great. We have a number of people. Yeah, the gentleman in the back, then you, and then you, sir. Yeah, just make sure to introduce yourself with your name, please. So.
Hi, just one question. This is Musab from LTI Mindtree.
Sorry, wrong microphone.
Sorry about that. This is Raghav Silveraj from LTI Mindtree. You use such words like adversarial contact, black box, and things like that. Yeah. And there is a section of the society that says we need to treat AI like a nuclear weapon, kind of contain it into a kind of off-limits place away from the world. But then again, we see news saying that some of the news organizations in the US in talks with big tech to try to train them on the news. So there's one side, they're trying to build that firewall, and there's another side, partly because of the profit or whatever the reasons. So they want to continue to engage with people like us, right? So where do you see this is going to go? That's my one question. And the second one is, on the regulatory side, right? We see in European Union, because of the Brussels effect, they're always ahead, compared to the US or other nation states, regulatory environment. But do you think, as we have seen even before the advent of Gen AI, right? We have seen select committees, Senate hearings where the politicians making fool of themselves, right? With this constantly changing technology, do you think our politicians are kind of equipped to regulate these new technologies?
So the last question first, because that's the easiest. No, they're not. They're definitely not. I think we're at the beginning of a journey right now. I think in the UK, so in my day job, I work very closely with public sector bodies to sort of upskill and develop readiness right across the regulatory bodies and across the civil service and whatnot. And I think we're in a good place in the UK. I think that there's been a lot of investment in trying to upskill the important decision makers, but it hasn't been enough, and it hasn't been high enough level. So we haven't educated C-suite people enough. I think I can't tell you how many ministerial level conversations I have where there's giddy excitement about what, from any point of rational point of view, would be considered kind of asinine. I mean, in terms of the technology itself. So I think we really do need to sort of develop, a richer culture of knowledge about this and change the narrative about this. On the first issue, I think I'm not a horses out of the barn type of person, but I think with our moment with generative AI, the horse is out of the barn. I mean, think about the billions that have been put into this, the breakneck commercialization, industrialization. This is the biggest commercial revolution in tech, the fastest commercial revolution in tech we've ever seen. I mean, within I think it was a couple of months, you had 100 million users of ChatGPT. Something like 80% of students in college have admitted to engaging in some form of support with generative AI models, right? So I mean, they're
very nicely phrased,
right? So it comes from being a teacher. So just to say, so I think that we're at a kind of a crisis management stage. I haven't slept very well for the past 6 months, and it's partially because of all these issues, but it's also partially because, I mean, this has been future shock, right? It's been a future shock. So Alvin Toffler, the old sociologist, talked about future shock as the kind of disorientation caused by the premature arrival of the future. And so I think a lot of society has been caught unawares here, and we're just going to need to catch up.
We have a lot of questions, so I would like to take maybe 2 at a time. So we first, you sir, and then you sir, so we can collect them and then we can answer them. There was someone over there. Oh yeah.
Hi. I'm Rahul from Hexaware, provider of technology services. David, one of the critical inputs for AI is availability of high-quality data to train it. Now, as we run out of publicly available data, and it's contentious what is public and not, because there are so many copyright cases that we are seeing. But as we kind of run out of steam with what is available on internet, do we see the tech industry using confidential user data to train future AI models? For example, Microsoft has invested in OpenAI, right? So they can ingest Outlook emails to train GPT-5 models, right? So if that becomes the direction of travel, what will be the implication of future AI models?
And that's nicely related, because if we're going to operate this system in the NHS, as you said, if you've got a model, you can ask it all kinds of questions. Is it safe to let the AI out if it's been trained, say, on GP data, health data? A kind of view of various surveys is, no, it's not safe, which means then commercial users, the AI is going to be trapped inside the environment. They'll have to find a business model around it being trapped in the environment where maybe it can provide a service. So what do you think about that?
I mean, on this last question, I think, so right now, I don't think the technology is at the point where it can serve clinical purposes. I mean, it might create efficiencies in the ways that the health system operates, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, in terms of the function and the operations of it, but in terms of the robustness of the system, to not confabulate, to not hallucinate, to produce outputs that we have confidence that aren't going to be brittle, so not responsive to context, et cetera. I'm not sure we're there yet. So I'm very concerned. I think there's a lot of people who are very concerned about the rush to use these systems in safety critical environments. And so I'm hesitant about that. But I think that we do need to sort of pay attention to developments, because I think there could be more robustness, ways to connect some ground truth and solidity, robustness into the system. The data question is a really difficult one. There's now you see I think it's Reddit trying to reject the use of somehow monetize and reject the use of their data to train systems. You've got all of these players that are suddenly realizing pardon my French, oh shit, we've been taken. Like all this data is being used by these big tech companies to train these systems of the future that are going to be part of their enlargement and profit model. So I think that this is a big transition moment. I would say about public data and trusted data. So we do need to expand models like trusted research environments to wider data spaces. So in the EU, for instance, now they're developing this kind of data infrastructure that's thought about as different layers of data spaces that then you make available for good kind of solid data science and data mining, right? First and foremost, we need to sort of develop high quality data infrastructure. And I think the UK has actually been pretty good on this one, and the EU is making leaps and bounds here too. But it will take a more concentration on fair data, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. It will take a renewed concentration on building public trust so that people are willing for system use and development that's oriented to the public benefit. People are willing to share their data, right? And we know, for instance, with health data, there's been a lot of surveys on this, that the public is very willing to share their health data if they think that data will be used to sort of for the benefit of society, right? So I do think, and maybe this is a good wrap-up point, I do think that we're at a moment where public trust is key, social trust is key, but at the same time, it's ironic because at this moment where we absolutely need trust to sort of make sure that these systems are being developed for public interest, we've got these systems that potentially undermine the integrity of the information ecosystem through the production of disinformation, through the production of misinformation, flooding our data ecosystem with synthetic generated content that will end up polluting downstream data sets, right? So really quickly, think about what's gonna happen from the moment that we started to have the generation of ChatGPT outputs into the internet, into the information ecosystem. Well, suddenly you've got human creation mixed with generative AI creation, right? Now, it's already been studied that what that will ultimately mean is downstream, when you start to retrain these models on artificially generated content, they lose their tail. There's a model that's called model collapse. And really what that means is that, it'll be harder to do good science. It'll be harder to make decent models and to advance the innovations themselves because we simply won't be able to pick the crap from the real human outputs. And I haven't heard a good solution to this, and yet we have the fire hose of generative AI right now literally flooding the public square with Gen AI content. So, I mean, this is something we really need to talk about moving forward because it will ultimately, harm the big data, the potential for big data.
We have time for one more question, very quick. Yusra, so you raised your hand. Microphone's coming in 30 seconds or so.
Thanks, David. So just my question was around regulation. Sorry, I'm Hugh Coughlin from Fujitsu. So, I mean, it's out of the box. The genie is out there. Everyone is doing a variant of it, as you said, Microsoft, everyone else. You have data sovereignty issues, you have litigation issues, and you have who owns that in terms of the chain, right? So, regulation is always lagged behind technology. So this is another example of where the regulation isn't there to support the technology. So do you see the regulators coming down heavy on this? Do you see them having to stop it? And then how is that cross-border legislative regulatory requirements going to be addressed?
So I think that we're closer now to having more swift regulatory intervention than we were before. And all we need to think about is how the Biden administration has said that the UK is well positioned to kind of lead the world in safe and responsible AI, and then they've called this World Summit on Safe and Responsible AI here for the winter. I'm just mentioning that because where I think we are is, it's kind of ironic that would be the case, because the regulatory white paper on AI was by many accounts vanilla, right? It wasn't aggressive enough. It wasn't appropriately proportionate to the kind of scale of dangers and risks that have arisen. That being said, there's motivation now, and there's motivation not simply for the development of national regulation. There is that, but also internationally interoperable regulation. So I was in Japan ahead of the G7 talking to their government, and their entire agenda was, how do we stitch together the international regulatory and standards environment to make aligned and interoperable regulation for AI? And that sort of chimed very well with the position of the UK government at the time. Now, I mean, that was even before we started to talk about this kind of summit environment. Now I think what we're experiencing is calls for a larger international regulatory body, right? Of kind of like an International Atomic Energy Agency, something like this. I think this is a good thing, and I think it will be a prospect that will be challenging, but I do think that steps in that direction are needed, and it's a good thing that the UK in particular is motivated to sort of do this right. I will also say that companies have largely called for this, right? I mean, it's not the lip service of big tech saying, oh, we want regulation, then lobbying against it. No, I mean, there's a real need for assurance, right, within the reputational economy, which is where we live now. And so I think that the arc from soft law, from all of the ethics and governance frameworks that are already out there, to more hard law, we're kind of in the middle of that arc. And it'll start with mandated transparency and accountability as necessary components of governance that are regulated.
Brilliant. Well, what a time to be alive. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insights. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank you. All right. Well, I'm afraid we're already out of time now. First of all, I wanted to thank so much again the Bahrain Economic Development Board for making this discussion here possible in the first place. I think there's a few really interesting points that have been made throughout this discussion, first to the first panel and now to this fireside chat. I think one nice way of putting it is that the horses are out of the barn. I think both in a positive way as well as sort of like mirroring the challenges that we're facing nowadays. But to my mind, I think the technological revolution is really on its way. And I think beyond hypes, beyond sort of what's going on in sort of the investment and between sort of the challenges and opportunities, I think it's a reality that we're facing nowadays and that we'll have to deal with. I hope you enjoyed this session. I personally felt I've learned a lot. Please do reach out. We will be available here outside in the corridors or also on LinkedIn. So let's stay in touch and hope to see you back very soon. Thank you.